Slide there?
Yes, we do.
Okay, very good. Then we're all set. All right, so I'm going to start off with my equipment. And I have finally gone over to the dark side and got a mirrorless camera. Now, over the last few years, I've had a large group of people that have been coming in my workshops with mirrorless cameras, and a lot of them would ask me questions about their camera, and I would have a hard time helping them because I didn't understand the mirrorless cameras like the DSLRs that I've been using for years. So I thought it was probably about time I should pick one up and get a little more familiar with it. So I bought the Fuji XT30 Mark II, and I've been really happy with it. I've been shooting it with it for about a year and a half now, and my sponsor Tamron provided me with this 18-300 lens, which has been working out really well. Now, the great thing about the mirrorless cameras are obviously is the size, and you can see compared to my Nikon D7500 on the top there, it's like half the size of that body. So much smaller. Now the lenses aren't much difference because both cameras have a C sensor, crop sensor body, crop sensor in those bodies. So lenses pretty much have to be the same, whether it's a mirrorless or a DSLR. So you don't save a lot of size on the lenses, but the bodies are really compact, and I like that. So it made it much easier for carrying it around and also just transporting and that. So I've been really happy with this Fuji camera, and looking forward to using it a lot more. Now, most of you probably have heard of Bill Fortney. He's been in the photo business for well over 40 years, maybe 50 years now. And he doesn't live too far from you guys. He's over in Corbin, Kentucky. Now, Bill had worked for Nikon for about 10 years, and I ran into him at a photo conference that I was speaking at. And he says, Mike, he says, I know you're using our D7000 camera, because this was quite a few years ago. And he said, and it's a good camera, but how come you're not using our professional bodies that we sell? I says, Bill, I says, 60% of the people that come into my workshops are using cameras that are under $1,000. I said, if I'm using your $6,500 pro camera body, I says, those people are going to leave my workshop saying, well, Mike's images look really good because he's got an expensive professional camera. And I've got a camera that's under $1,000. I won't get images as good as Mike does. So all the cameras that I purchased have always been under $1,000. So that D7500 that you saw was, I think I bought it was $899 when I bought that a few years back. The Fuji XT30 Mark II was also $899, I believe. I think that one went up a little bit in price, but try to stay in that 1,000 or less. And it's really to show those people that have the less expensive cameras that you don't need an expensive camera to produce top quality macro images. Now, I wouldn't tell you that this lower price camera would be a good choice for someone that maybe needs high frames per second, shoots a lot of fast frames per second, or maybe someone that shoots in a very low light conditions and needs a really high ISO with low noise. Those people tend to have to purchase a more expensive camera that can do what they need it to do. But for macro photography, none of those things matter. So we can get by with, I could get by with the Canon $350 DSLR that they came out with and produce top quality images with that camera. So whatever you own camera body wise, or even how old it is, doesn't matter. They'll all do great work for macro photography. Now, the macro lens that I use is the Tamron 90mm macro lens, and you can see priced on that is $649. And then the 18-400 zoom lens is what I use on my 7500 Nikon, and that runs $649. My 18-300 is for the Fuji mirrorless camera, $699, and the tripod I have is $220 and $369. So if you added all that up, all my equipment together would still be less than some of the mid-range camera bodies that are out there, and of course any of the professional camera bodies. So you can get by with a little less money as a macro photographer. Now the macro lenses, they come in short, mid, and long range in the focal lengths, and these are the ones that are the most common that I see in my workshops. The short focal length you'll see over on the left says 60, and that would be a Tamron, Nikon, and Canon. Sigma is actually a 50 millimeter, so that's their short range. When you go into the mid-range, on the low end would be the Tamron 90, and the 100 millimeter would be the Canon, and the 105 would be Sigma and Nikon. In the telephoto lenses, on the low end would be the Sigma 150, and in the 180, which was always the most popular of the telephoto macro lenses, would be the Tamron, Sigma, and Canon. And on the longest of the true macro lenses would be the Nikon 200. Now, you'll be surprised to know that most of these lenses that I've just mentioned are discontinued. They no longer offer them anymore for DSLRs. Tamron has no lenses, macro lenses for DSLRs. They've discontinued all of them. I contacted Noah at Hunts Photo, and they only have 2 macro lenses, a Canon 100, Nikon 105. All the other lenses have been discontinued for DSLRs. So those of you that are hanging on to your DSLRs and want to get a macro lens, you're going to have to buy those used, because you're not going to be able to get them new. Now, you may find one of those lenses still on a shelf in a camera store somewhere, but in the future, once they're gone, they won't be available anymore. And the reason why is because most of the people that are manufacturing lenses are going to mirrorless macro lenses. So look at all the lenses that are for your mirrorless cameras. So mirrorless is the future, and that's why they've discontinued a lot of their DSLR lenses, and they're going and putting all their energy and time and effort into making more of the macro lenses for the mirrorless cameras. So it's just kind of the way things work. We know how when you were back in the film days and it went to digital, and everybody had to make that move from digital or from film to digital. Well, kind of now it's going from DSLRs to mirrorless cameras. Now, in the upper right corner, you'll see a short lens on the camera body, and that is a 60 millimeter Tamron lens. Now, I'm going to photograph this Rose of Sharon flower, and if you know that flower, it's a pretty good size flower. It's not a small flower, and I want to fill the frame with that flower. And you can see the image that I shot with the 60 millimeters in the upper left corner. So in order to fill the frame like you see it there, I had to get in pretty close with that 60 millimeter lens. Now, the image below that, you can see a little longer lens on that camera body, and that's a 90 millimeter Tamron, mid-range. And in order to get the same framing and shoot the exact same shot like I did with the 60 millimeter, I had to back away from that flower. So this is what we call working distance. So I go to a longer focal length macro lens. I gain some working distance between me and that subject. Now on the bottom, that's a 180 macro lens. See, it's a big, heavy lens. And in order to get the exact same framing, just like I did with the 60 millimeter, I had to back quite a distance away from that flower. Now, why is that important? Well, let's say that flower was a live subject. Let's say it was a butterfly or a dragonfly. Probably wouldn't be too happy if I'm about a foot away from it with a 60 millimeter macro lens. But with a 180 lens or a 200 or 150, you can see I'm going to be a great distance away from that subject, and greater chance it's going to stay there and not fly off. So a lot of bug photographers tend to use the telephoto macro lenses so they can get that extra working distance between the subject and their lens. But I will tell you that probably 80–85% of the people that come in my workshops are using mid-range. They're using 90 millimeters, 100 millimeters, 105 millimeters. And the reason why they're in that mid-range is because of the price range. See, when you start talking telephoto macro lenses, you were getting up into that $1,300, $1,500 range. And so a lot of people didn't want to invest that much money in a dedicated macro lens. So most people ended up with the mid-range, because you get into like the 90 millimeter Tamron 649, your Canons, Nikons, maybe another $100 or so, a little bit more. But it was more of a price issue. And that's why most people ended up in that mid-range. And they work fine. I'm using that mid-range because, again, there's nothing else available now anymore. Now, what I'm using mainly, I have to tell you that I don't use my macro lens anymore. My macro lens basically stays home now. And the reason being is because I'm using zoom lenses that say they have macro capabilities. Now, when they say they have macro capabilities, they don't mean the true in close is a true macro lens would, but they can get into a pretty small area, and I'll show you that in a second. Now this is the 18-400, and that's what I use on my DSLR 7500 Nikon, and on my my mirrorless Fuji camera I use the 18-300 zoom lens. Now what's nice about these lenses is that if I want to, show an environmental shot of where I'm shooting, like here I'm in this swampy area photographing leaves floating on water, and I want to show that for teaching purposes, I can always put that 18-400 on another camera body, set it up on a tripod, set myself timer and go out there and photograph myself with that 18 millimeters to show a wide angle. Then if I'm in a swampy area with some duckweed and frogs poking their heads out, I've got 400 millimeters to reach out and capture that subject at a distance. So that's nice that, to have that range to be able to reach out and capture subjects at a distance. It really, really works great when you're in botanical gardens where you have to stay on that pathway and you can't get off of that pathway and move in close with your macro lens. You can just kind of zoom in with that telephoto lens. And most all your lenses nowadays that are being produced all have the ability to focus in close on your subjects. Now I photographed this with the 18-400, and that is a small flower from a cactus. And you can see I was able to get in there and capture a full shot of that flower with that 18-400. Now these lenses, both the 18-400 plus the 18-300 that I have for the mirrorless, will actually photograph a subject as small as 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. That's a pretty small area. Now, I'd say about 95% of what I photograph is larger areas than 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. So these lenses do 95% of the work that I do. So I don't generally take my macro lenses out anymore. And even if I have to shoot a little large area with these large megapixel cameras, like my Fuji being 26 megs, I can crop out a small area out of those larger photos if I can't get in real tight with my 18-400 or the 18-300. Now, if I needed to get into a smaller area, like inside this little pocket watch here, I can use my Tamron 90, and that'll get me in smaller than what I can do with the 18-400 or the 18-300. So by having both, a macro lens and then also the zoom lenses, you can take care of all the different situations that you're going to come across. The tripod I use is the Vanguard VEO 3 Plus 263. Now, what's nice about the Vanguard tripod, it has a center post that rises all the way up in the air and then goes into a horizontal position like you see it here. So when I'm trying to get over top of a subject to shoot overhead, I can move that center post up and into a horizontal position and get over top of it. Now, Manfrotto's had a tripod for many years that does the same thing, but the problem with the Manfrotto is that if I wanted to now move that camera closer to the subject or, raise it up higher away from the subject, you'd have to do it with all three of the legs. You'd have to adjust each leg to get it to move up and down. But with the Vanguard, it's got a little lever on the side there that you can release that lever and that center post will lower and raise up so you can move the camera closer or farther away. You can also move the tripod kind of out of your way. If you're shooting flowers, you don't want that tripod in front of you. And also the legs will go straight out. So you can put the base of the tripod right on the ground, and then with the center post extended out, you can maneuver your camera as low as you need to go up. You can actually put the camera right on the ground if you needed to. So that is an excellent tripod and not even that expensive. It's like $220. The other nice feature that they put into this VEO series that they came out with about 2 years ago was that you can unscrew one of the legs from the tripod and turn it into a monopod. So you can take the leg off, put your head on top of the monopod, and then if you're in a gardens and they say no tripods, you can always unscrew the leg and use it as a monopod. And most gardens are okay with letting you come in with a monopod if they don't allow tripods. Now, most of you probably own a ball head, and ball heads have a big metal housing, and at the top the little ball is positioned up there, and in the front you can see here you've got this little U slot. Now that U slot is for macro photographers that tend to shoot towards the ground. You'll maneuver your camera down into that U slot so that you can shoot at the ground. And then you may have to pivot the ball head back and forth to get into positions. So it's a little bit limited because of that, working in that U slot. It can be done. It's just a little bit tougher. But with macro photography, we tend to, maneuver our cameras in all kinds of different angles and different positions to get our framing on our subject. Unlike, say, a landscape or wildlife photographer that just shoots straight ahead all the time, so they very rarely would use that U slot. But we are constantly maneuvering into all kinds of angles with our camera. Now, the head that I'm using is made by Acratech, Acratech, and this is called the Ultimate Ball Head. Now you can see they've cut away all that big, heavy metal housing like you saw in the last one. So it's very lightweight, made out of aluminum, so it's a very super lightweight head. Now the key to this head is the front area right here has been cut away, totally cut away. So now I can maneuver my camera into any position or angle I need to go to get my framing on my subject. I don't have to work in a U slot and pivot the head back and forth. I can leave the head just like you see it and just move my camera in any angle and any position I need to go with that head. So that is the best head that I found for macro. And with that tripod, the Vanguard tripod, it's the best setup I've come across. Now, the head itself is not, inexpensive. I mean, it runs about $360, I think it is now. So it's a little pricey, but if you can afford it, it's an excellent head for your macro, but also can be used for any kind of photography, not just macro, can be used for anything, but it's an excellent head, very, very well made. Now, I'm not going to cover too many accessories tonight, but have to cover the most important accessory, and that's a diffuser. Now, this is a Dame's rocket flower, and you can see the top portions, the petals are kind of a pink color, but they're not supposed to be pink, they're supposed to be purple. Now, you may think that's, you shoot on a sunny day, light can be kind of harsh, can wash out colors, but this was shot on a cloudy day. So even on cloudy days, we can get enough intensity and reflection off the white clouds overhead that'll come down and actually wash out colors on our subjects. And it typically is the subjects that the petals or the leaves or whatever you're shooting that are running parallel to the sky. And if there's no shade overhead or anything like that blocking into that light coming down from those clouds. So what you need to do is get a 12-inch diffuser. They do make larger sizes like 20 and 22-inch, but I've always used the 12-inch for the last 20 years. I like the 12-inch because it's more compact. It'll actually fold into itself down to about 4 inches across, and I can actually put it right in my pocket. Now, once you put that diffuser over top of that Dame's rocket you just saw, brings the color back to the natural purple it's supposed to be. It's like a magic trick when you see it happen. You're looking at washed out colors and you put that diffuser over top it and bam, the color comes right back to the natural color it's supposed to be. So this is, again, is on a cloudy day even when this happened. Again, there's just some reflections off those white clouds or light intensity that's being bounced off those clouds that can wash out colors. So you can see on the left side, no diffuser, right side with the diffuser. On that same cloudy day, I was walking down a trail and I happened to look to my left. I saw this leaf and I could see the top of the leaf, the color was washed out. I mean, you can see this with your eyes. The color was gone. But if you notice on the front of the leaf where it dipped down, the front of the leaf is 90 degrees to the sky and it retains its color. It's that stuff on the top that's parallel to the sky, which is what's washing out. So what we do is put our diffuser over top of it and we can bring some color back into that top portion. Now, the top portion is not quite as dark as it is in the front of the leaf, but at least there's enough color there that in my post-processing, I can go into that top section and I can darken that area down to match up with the front of the leaf. But if I was working with that one on the left, with that washed out top, it'd be very difficult to bring that back to match up with the front. So at least I have some color to work with on the one on the right with the diffuser over top of it. So again, it's like a magic trick when you see it happen. It's amazing how you can go from, washed out white to full color. Now, what happens on a sunny day? Well, on a sunny day, I'm going to diffuse my subject 100% of the time. Did you hear that? 100% of the time. I do not let sunlight hit my subject unless I'm using sunlight for special effect like backlighting. But if it's just direct light overhead or coming straight at it, I'm going to diffuse it 100% of the time. There's three things that happen when sunlight hits your subject. Number one, it can alter the color of the subject and actually change the color of the subject. Two, it can wash out colors and turn things to kind of white, just like it does on a cloudy day. And three, it can create shadows in areas that I might not want shadows. So again, there's three bad things that happen when that sun hits your subject. So I'm going to diffuse 100% of the time on everything I photograph when the sun is out. Now, the image on the left, that's early morning sunlight that is directly hitting onto that sumac branch. And what's happened is it has altered the color of the subject. They're more of a yellowish green right now when they're not supposed to be a yellowish green. Also, you get a couple little just minor shadows here, nothing big, but sometimes, you're shooting subjects where you get a lot more shadows in there. Now, once I put the diffuser between the sumac branch and the sunlight and shade it, you can see the image on the right side. That is the natural green that the leaf is supposed to be. And so, like I said, the sunlight altered the green, changed it. Also, you notice no more shadows over here on the right side in the little leaves right here. So I'm going to diffuse 100% of the time when the sun's directly hitting my subject. Sometimes you may use your diffuser when you're indoors. Sometimes you're going to be shooting a subject that might have a little sheen to it, and the light's going to hit it at the right angle. It's going to cause little hot spots on that sheeny area. Now, some people say, could you use a polarizing filter or polarizing screw-on polarizing filter on your lens? And that will work some of the times, but it doesn't work 100% of the time because it has to be at the right angle to the light before it works properly. Whereas with the diffuser, it works 100% of the time. So you're taking a chance when you use it, a polarizer, that it might not work all the time. And a diffuser is going to cost you a small fraction of what it costs for a polarizer. Now you're wondering, do you have to hold this diffuser all the time with your hand? You could hold it. You could just hand hold it if you wanted to. But if you wanted an assistant to help you, you could buy the clamp. Now you can see the clamp has a big, large clamp on the left side, and then there's a flexible tubing. And then on the other side, there's another smaller clamp there. Now what you do is if you're in really close to your flower, like you see here, I've got this butterfly weed right there. And I'm in fairly close with a macro lens. So I could actually just attach that clamp right onto the leg of my tripod. And then on the other side, have my diffuser hooked into that clamp. And then that'll hold my diffuser over top for me. And then I don't have to mess with holding it myself. I can work my camera. Now, let's say that you're using a long macro lens or a zoom lens and you're 3 feet away from that flower. That flexible tubing is not long enough when it's attached to the tripod to reach out and put your diffuser over top of the flower. So what Wimberly did, the manufacturer of the clamp, they came up with a stake system. So you can see there's a hollow tube for the stake, and then it has a screwdriver that's inserted up inside there. And then once you pull that screwdriver out, you reverse it, put it back into the tube, and then you stake it into the ground next to your flower. Then you can take your clamp it onto the stake, and that'll hold your diffuser over top of your flower. And then you'll be back farther away from the flower with your camera and tripod, and then you can also move around with it, and you don't have to worry about holding your diffuser. So the clamp is a really good system for holding that. Also, they show on their website that you could also stake it in the ground next to the flower, and then you could attach it to the stem of the flower. So in case there's a little slight wind and the flower's moving back and forth, you can steady the flower with the clamp on the stem. Now they have some foam that's inside of the clamp so that when you clamp it onto the stem, it doesn't cause any damage. Camera settings, I have my ISO set fairly high. On my D7500 Nikon, I've got it set at 1000 ISO. And on the mirrorless camera, when I bought that a year and a half ago, I contacted one of the tech reps at Fuji, and I asked him, how high can I go on the ISO with this camera? And he says, you can go really high. I says, well, like, is 2000 too high? He says, oh no. He says, you can shoot at 2000 and get clean images. I said, okay, so I'll try it. So I've been shooting at 2000 ISO for the last year and a half, and it's worked great. Reason why I tend to shoot with those high ISO numbers is because I'm shooting at high f-stop numbers, 22 to 32. So you need a little faster shutter speeds, and those high ISOs allow me to do that. Now you can shoot in manual or aperture priority. I started out 20 some years ago shooting manual. I was taught that way. And so I've always shot manual mode over the years, but you could just shoot in aperture priority, and all you're responsible for is just setting your f-stop, and the camera will do the shutter speed. In manual, I set my f-stop and I also set the shutter speed. But aperture priority, I know a lot of pros that shoot in aperture priority all the time, and they just worry about setting their f-stop and let the camera handle the exposure shutter speed. Now, this is where I do all my flower photography in my home. It's on my stairway. And so I say, why would you shoot on the stairway? Because that is the brightest place for light in my house. It's a 2-story high foyer, and there's a huge window at the front of my house. And that huge window allows this amazing bright light to come in and kind of just wrap itself around the flowers. It's amazing how it works real well there. When I first started shooting, I actually started next to a door wall, big, 6-foot glass door wall, and I set up a table there. The problem is the light is directional on it, just one way it's coming. And so that worked okay, but it wasn't as good as once I discovered the stairway. That worked out much better. Now, one of the problems with shooting flowers indoors in our homes is that we need some kind of a background. So obviously I don't want stairs as the background behind my flowers. Now, when I first started, I was using black fleece, and I was using white backgrounds behind my flowers, and I just got kind of bored and tired with black and white backgrounds, and they never looked natural to me anyways. I wanted some kind of a background that looked like something I photographed in nature. And so I decided to go out and create my own backgrounds that I could print and put behind my subjects indoors. So what you do is go out into the field. I like to go out into the woods and wander around, and you could do this in your backyard with just the grass in outside your home. But I just decided to go out to the local field here, and photograph some grass out there. Now, if you have a macro lens, this tends to work the best for this. We're going to show you how I do it. So you want to be on a tripod, and you can see I'm quite a distance away from the subject, but you could get in closer to it if you wanted to. It probably actually is a little better because you get a little shallower depth of field. So this is the subject that I'm going to photograph, and I've got it in focus, so you can see what it looks like in focus. Now, when we're manually focusing our lens, when we get the subject in focus, and you know that if you take that focusing ring and you rotate it slightly left or slightly right of the focus point, it starts to go soft and out of focus. So what you want to do is just take that focusing ring and rotate it a few turns to the left, and then go the opposite way, a few turns to the right. Now, one of the two ways on my macro lens, it works best when I go to the right side. You'll actually rotate it to the point where that subject, that grass you just saw, will go completely out of focus to a solid color. So when you get it to that solid color, you photograph it, and you end up with that right there. So that grass with my macro lens taken out of focus is that right there. And you photograph it, and you'll get a nice natural green from nature that you can use as your background when you're shooting indoors. That is the exact same color I get when I shoot outdoors, and I get my subject in focus and I blur out the grass that's in the background. So it's a natural look that we get when we shoot out in the field and blur out colors in the background. So let's say that you look at that solid color and you go, I wish I had, maybe a little bit of texture in there, some blotchiness or something, and you can just not take it to a solid color when you're taking it out of focus. So on this subject here, I just rotated it to where I left a little bit of texture in there, a little bit of blotchiness. And you might like that a little better. Maybe you think that looks more natural. If you're shooting something like this where you have some yellow flowers in there with some brown grasses, then you might get a little bit different color green, a little more of a yellowish green. If you're shooting with some pinks, you'll get some pinks amongst the greens. And I go into botanical gardens where they have large plots of, multicolored flowers, and I just take them out of focus and photograph them. And then I have different colors that I can use when I'm shooting indoors. Now, when you print these out, you want to print them on a matte paper. So you can see right up here, it says M-A-T-T-E, matte, because that has no sheen on the paper. It's just a flat paper. And if you were to, print on a gloss or a photo or semi-gloss, luster, any of those papers with a little sheen on it, if you're position it behind your subject and it hits the right angle of the light, it can kind of fade out that color or wash it out a little bit. So the matte papers work the best, no sheen on there. Let's say you don't want to go through the hassle of, making your own. You could always go and buy some solid color papers at a hobby store and use those. You could also look at flypapertextures.com. They have 55 textures that you can purchase for $40. And then you can print those textures out and use those as your backgrounds. So you'll have more of a textured background. These are actually designed so that you use them in post-processing when you're on your computer, where you actually take those textures and you overlay them on top of your image, and then you erase the texture off of the subject. And then that just you leave it as the background then. So that's how they're really designed, is to actually overlay in post-processing. But you can actually download these files and print them out and then use them behind your subject when you're shooting. And I find that much easier than doing it in post-processing and overlaying it and having to erase the texture off of the subject. Now you're going to want to take these prints and put some kind of a backboard on them, because you're going to want to stiffen them up. You don't want this floppy paper. So you can use either matte board, like we use for matting our photos. You can use foam core, which is what they use on the backside of your prints when they frame them, or cardboard. Just anything that is a stiff material that you can attach that print to, that'll stiffen it up so it's not going to flop around on you. Now, when you go to put these prints together on top of your backboard, you want to get some carpet tape. Now, carpet tape has adhesive on both sides of the tape. So what you do is you cut off strips of the carpet tape, put it on your backboard. Like you see here, I've got 4 strips on that are attached to the backboard. And then you'll have this paper here that's, over top of this, the adhesive surface that you pull off. And once you pull those off, you'll be able to take your print, lay it right on your backboard, and it'll stick really well to it. I've been using this stuff for years and it's worked really good. Now, when I talk to macro photographers or people that are getting into macro photographers, and I ask them what do they having issues with, it's always the same answer. It's the depth of field. They don't quite understand, how much depth of field they get when they're in really close or back farther away, because it can change. They also don't understand what f-stop they should be at to get maximum depth of field or shallow depth of field a lot of times. So it's actually very simple. It's really not that difficult. Now, there's 2 different styles here. The image on the left is what we call a soft focus flower image. And that's done with our macro lens when we're shooting in the smallest f-stop number. Now, that could be anywhere from a 2.0 to 2.8 to 3.5, depending on the macro lens you have, or if you're using a zoom lens. But you'll get very shallow depth of field when you're shooting at that 2.8 on my 90 millimeter. And as you can see, all that's in focus is about 1/8 of an inch right in the center here. And everything else has gone to a soft blur. So this is a very popular style amongst macro photographers, shooting soft focus, where you get very little in focus and a lot out of focus. I will tell you, though, that I have not had much success with this style. When I was in the art show business for 7 years, the very first year, I took a lot of these soft focus flower images and hung them on the wall, thinking they were artistic, and nobody bought them. After the first year, I just pulled them all out of my booth and never brought them back. Nobody was interested in soft focus flowers. What happens is when you show this type of an image to your family, your friends, what happens is the first thing out of their mouth when they see it is, why is it out of focus? Because they shoot with their camera phones and their point and shoot cameras, and those cameras get everything in focus when they shoot. So they don't understand why you have an expensive, camera and a expensive lens, and you can't get it all in focus. They just don't understand that style of photography. Even in competitions and camera clubs, I had many people tell me that they've entered soft focus into their competition, and the judges will knock it down because they say they want to see more in focus. But that's not how you do, soft focus flowers in macro. The image on the right side, that has everything in focus from top to bottom, side to side, front to back. And that is done with the highest f-stop number on the lens. Now, it could be anywhere from 22 on some lenses up to 32. On my lenses, they all go to 32. So I shoot a lot of these images where I want everything in focus at the highest f-stops. So these are examples of shallow depth of field again. And as you can see, there's very little in focus. I focus basically on the edge of this petal right here of the trillium flower. And with the 3.5 on a 180 macro lens, you can see how it softens into the flower and then blurs the background completely out. Same with this dragonfly, just focused on his face with the small f-stop, and you can see just behind his head, as his heads are tiny. You can see it's already out of focus and the wings out of focus, and then the grass in the background is just a solid blur into a solid green. This is a goat's beard seed head, similar to like a dandelion, but 10 times bigger. And I just focus kind of on this stem right here. And with the 2.8 on the 90 millimeter macro lens, you can see it gives a real nice soft, it's kind of a dream-like quality to it, which is, again, real popular amongst macro photography. Now, this is the style that I tend to shoot and what I like best. I like everything in focus. So you can see here, this nice rose shot has got top to bottom, side to side, front to back, all in focus, f32. This one here, I posted on many forums on Facebook groups, and I always get the same question. People say, did you focus stack that image? I go, nope, one shot, f32. It got it all in focus. This frog was shot at f32. Now, I did an article for Outdoor Photographer magazine a few years back, and this frog was one of the images that was in the article. And the editor emailed me when he was setting up the article, and he says, that frog shot, he says, you listed the f-stop at f32. He said, is that correct, or did you make a mistake on it? I says, no, that's what I shot it at, f32. He says, okay. He says, I just never heard anybody shooting at high f-stops like that. I says, well, you have the file there. I says, the data is right there in the file. You can look at it if you like. And so about an hour later, he emails me back again. He says, you know what? I did look at the file. He says, you're right. It says f32. I says, yeah. I says, I shoot at that all the time. Now, you're all thinking the same thing right now, because if you've been around camera clubs and been into cameras for long enough, you've always been told never to shoot over f16 because you're going to get diffraction. Most of the time, people will say you want to shoot around f8, maybe up to f11, because you get the least amount of diffraction in those f-stops. Now, inside your lens, you have an aperture that opens and closes. And on the left, you'll see at 2.8, the aperture is wide open. And so when someone says, oh, I shot that image wide open, they mean the aperture inside the lens is wide open. Now, as you go to the higher f-stop numbers, so f4 and 5, 6 and f8, 11, 16, 22, you can see the aperture inside the lens is going to a smaller and smaller and a smaller and a smaller opening until it gets to the highest f-stop number. And then you're at this very little tiny opening right here. All right. Now you're going to photograph a subject at f22, or in my case, f32, with that little tiny opening inside your lens. Now, the light that is coming into the lens from the subject you're photographing, it's coming into this big open lens. And as it's going through that lens, it hits that small aperture. Now that light is trying to squeeze through that tiny little opening to get to the sensor. And as it's squeezing through that little opening, it has a tendency to kind of shift the light and move a little, so that when the light hits the sensor, and produces the image, your image comes out a little bit soft. It doesn't come out tack sharp. It softens down the details at highest f-stop, and that's what we call diffraction. This image was shot at f32, and I shoot a lot of subjects in real close where I'm getting shallow depth of field. And when you get in very, very close to subjects, your depth of field shrinks down to very little. See, landscape photographers many times can shoot at f8 and get lots of depth of field, but that doesn't happen in macro photography. You get very little depth of field even at f8. So in order to achieve maximum depth of field, go into those high f-stops to get more depth of field. Now, the great thing about digital photography is that we have these amazing tools for post-processing. So we have Photoshop and Topaz programs and Nix software programs, and the program that I use for my processing is called Smart Photo Editor. Now, these programs all offer either an independent little software or it's built into the program, a sharpening tool or a sharpening program. And those sharpening programs are designed to create sharpness in your image if they're not real sharp. So just like we correct, our exposures in our images in post-processing, we correct colors, change colors, we correct contrast. We do so many things in our images when we post-process them to make them look better. Well, when we get diffraction from shooting those high f-stops, we can use the sharpening tools to sharpen the images and make them look sharp. So this image here, I cropped it out and then I did my sharpening, and there it is. So you can see the image looks like it came out of the camera very sharp. But again, it was the sharpening tools that produced that from the soft image. But I needed that high f-stop to get the maximum depth of field. Otherwise, I wouldn't have all those parts of that flower in focus. Same with this one here. You can see when you look at all the fine details all through here, it's not real sharp coming out of the camera. So I'm going to crop this, sharpen it, and you can see everything is very sharp. So you can also take the sharpness to whatever level you want. I like very sharp, okay? But some people will say, well, I don't want it that sharp. I want it a little less sharpened, but you can adjust it to wherever you like it, okay? I like mine very sharp. You can see the image on the left, a lot of depth in those two flowers from front to back. And so in order to achieve that much depth of field, I needed to get into that highest f-stop to get there. Now, the image on the right side, that is a book cover. And that book was called Group F64. Now, you should go to Amazon and buy this book. They have it on Amazon, and it's a very interesting read. Now, I think it was the 30s or the 40s, one of those decades, Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, and I think there was 5 or 6 other photographers started their own camera club in California, and they called the camera club Group F64 because the philosophy of the photographers in that group, Edward Weston, Ansel Adams, and these other photographers, was they wanted everything in focus on their images. So they wanted it top to bottom, side to side, front to back, all in focus. And what they found is that they were shooting at the high f-stops of their lenses. F64 is where they were shooting. So all these photographers were shooting at f64, and that's why the club was called Group F64. So here Ansel Adams was shooting high f-stops to get maximum depth of field. So if it's good enough for Ansel Adams, it's surely good enough for me. So you don't need to focus stack, okay? To me, focus stacking is a total waste of time. Why would you sit there and shoot a dozen images of something at different focal points when I can do the exact same thing, get it all in focus with one shot? With focus stacking, you have to look at your subject. You have to evaluate the depth of the subject that you're going to shoot. Let's say you're shooting a flower that's 3 inches from front to back. Then you choose your f-stop. So maybe you'll say, I don't want to get any diffraction, so I'll shoot at f8, where you're going to get the least amount of diffraction. And how much you're going to get in focus when you're in 10 inches from that subject, how much is going to be in focus. So there's actually calculators that'll tell you that you can download into your phone, and you can estimate how far you are away from that subject, what f-stop you're using. It'll actually tell you how much depth of field you're going to get. So let's say that we're going to get a 1/4 inch depth of field at f8. So there is 3 inches that I have to cover, where I have to shoot different points throughout that image and focus on different points as at each image that I photograph. So if I'm getting only a 1/4 inch in focus, I'm going to have to shoot 12 shots, because there's 12 quarters in those 3 inches. So I would start off in the very front part of the flower, and I would take my first shot, and then I would refocus in a 1/4 inch deeper, shoot the second one, refocus a 1/4 inch deeper, shoot the third one, focus into now I'm in 1 inch into the flower. That's my 4th shot. And then I have to go through 2 more inches yet. So I have to shoot 12 images. And now focus stacking, companies will tell you should also overlap a little bit, so you don't maybe miss a section. So maybe you'd have to shoot, 15, 16 images to get it in focus if you're overlapping in between those. That's a lot of images to shoot. And then you have to take those 12 images or more, and you have to download them into your computer, and you can get Helicon Focus or Zarine Stacker, or Photoshop does focus stacking now. And you take those 12 images, put them into that stacking program, and it'll take the sharpest part of each one of those images and merge them into one fully focused flower. And so then you'll have a nice sharp flower from front to back. But yet I can do the same thing with one shot at f32. So I just don't understand why anybody would want to go through all that hassle when we can get it done with one shot. Been doing this for 20 years. The other problem with focus stacking is if you're going to do it outdoors, I don't know where you live, but it's windy every day where I live. All right. I go out at daybreak to shoot when the wind is at the lowest amount. But if you're out later in the daytime, it's darn near impossible to get a flower to stand still and shoot it, a dozen times. So very difficult to do, and also just a waste of time, in my opinion. Now, focus stacking has its purpose, and it was really designed for high magnification microscopes for shooting cells. And when you're shooting in very high magnification, even if you were using your macro lens with maybe a filters or extension tubes between the lens and the camera body to get you into the higher magnifications than 1:1, say you're into 3:1, 4:1, 5:1 magnifications, your depth of field shrinks down to almost nothing when you're in that close. So that's where focus stacking comes in, because even with the highest f-stop, you can't get it all in focus when you're in that close. So that's where you would use focus stacking. But for general, macro 1:1 or close-up photography, you can get as much depth of field as you need by just shooting at the highest f-stop. Now, I want to show you the difference between this, f2 and 32 on the lens here that I'm using. That's a Tamron 90. I'm going to photograph this ruler on the table. Now you can see the front of the lens is kind of like on an angle to the ruler. It's not parallel to it, because typically on flat subjects or subjects, we like to try to get the front of the lens parallel to the subject. But you may not be able to get parallel to every subject you shoot. You might have to shoot at an angle, and you have to learn, how to do that when you're on an angle to that subject. Now, when I'm shooting at 2.8 in that close with a macro lens, I only get 1/8 of an inch of those lines in focus. One little tiny eighth. Get a ruler out and look how much an eighth is. It's tiny, not much. And you can see just this line that is outside of that 1/8 is already starting to go soft. So that's the problem with macros. When you get in really close to your subjects, your depth of field shrinks down really small. And as you can see, as you go to the outer edges there, it'll eventually blur into almost a solid color. Over on the right side, f32, you can see the ruler's all in focus at f32. All right. Now it might be slightly soft at the outer sides, but again, you're getting some of that diffraction in there, but you can easily sharpen all that up in your post-processing with your sharpening programs. All right, now I've got a spruce cone that I hung 4 feet in front of the spruce tree. So that spruce tree, remember, that is 4 feet behind that cone. Now I'm shooting with a 180 telephoto macro lens. The smallest f-stop is 3.5. Now I've got the front of the lens parallel to the flat part of the cone here. So at 3.5, when you're parallel, you can get all that in focus. But where this cone dips down to the tip right here, just that slight dip, you've already lost focus at 3.5. And you can see the needles in the foreground right here are soft. And even some of the needles here in the foreground in front of the flat part are a little bit soft. But 3.5 doesn't have enough depth of field to reach back 4 feet So the tree just kind of blurs into almost a solid color. So that's kind of what we like to have, is that nice blurred background behind our subject. That the problem is I'm not getting enough depth of field on my subject that I want. So need to get into a higher f-stop number so I can get more depth of field on my subject. So I'm going to go to an f8. Now at f8, the tip of the cone now is in focus, so the whole cone's in focus, but the needles in the foreground are still a little bit soft because they're out in front of that cone. So you can see even at f8, you don't get a lot of depth of field. You know, even those needles that are only about an inch in front of that cone aren't in focus yet, but there's just enough depth of field to reach back and show a little shadowing in the needles in that tree in the background. So you start to get a little bit of shadowing effect from the needles that are in that spruce tree. And again, that's at 4 feet behind. Now, I still want to get these needles in the foreground in focus, so I'm going to just jump up to F16 here. Now, F16 has enough depth of field to get all my subject in focus, perfect focus, but look what happens to my background. It's starting to get cluttered up because F16 has enough depth of field to come back and pull in some more details on those needles. Now, if I wanted to get those needles in focus, if I went to F32, those would probably all be in focus too. So the problem is, and this is what you hear from a lot of people, say, well, I'm shooting small f-stops all the time. Well, why do you do that? Well, because it helps blur my backgrounds out. So I get some nice clean backgrounds. The problem is you don't get enough depth of field in your subject. It's half in focus, half out of focus. And if they go to the higher f-stop to get the subject all in focus, then it goes back and brings in all the details in the background and clutters up the background. So that's where macro photographers struggle with, and they don't understand what to do. So these are images that I photographed out in the field. This is a flower that I photographed where I got the flower in focus, but still was able to get that background to blur out. And you saw this one earlier. It's a jewel weed, some dewdrops on a little stem there with a little dewdrop on the top of the leaf, and grass in the background that is blurred out, but yet you can see the subject's all in focus. And this flower here is all in focus with a nice clean background behind it. Our critter portraits, we want our critters in focus, and we want that nice clean background. And it's a little hoverfly on a knapweed flower with a nice clean background, and this dewy covered dragonfly, all nice sharp focus with a nice pond in the background that turned to that blue color. So this is what we don't want. We don't want clutter in our background, messing our backgrounds up. We want nice clean backgrounds. So this is how you do that. It's very simple. It's really not that difficult. It's very easy to get subject all in focus and blur out the background. So this is called the key to flower and critter portraits. So what we need to do is find the right subject. And what I mean by the right subject is an isolated subject that is away from clutter, that's away from the clutter. And then we need to find a camera angle to that subject with the background as far away as possible. And the farther away the background is from the subject, the higher the f-stop can go and get more depth of field while still maintaining a blurred background. So this is the field that I shot the Dame's rocket flower. Remember the flower I showed you earlier that was washed out, and I put the diffuser, brought the purple back? This is where I shot it. This is the day. This is a cloudy day. And you can see these flowers grow in big clusters. Okay, so they're all clustered together here. And that's difficult to shoot these flowers, because if you decide on any one of the flowers you see in this cluster here, where's your background going to be? Well, it's literally inches behind your flower, so that's not going to work. So when you get into these areas with big clusters of flowers, you want to go to the outside perimeters of the clusters and look for single flowers that are growing by themselves out here. Or maybe you can find one that's up higher than all the flowers with nothing behind it. So I chose this one right here. Let me zoom in on that, and there it is. Look at how that flower is isolated, and it's sitting there all by itself with nothing behind it. Now there is a woods back there behind it, but that woods is about 15 feet behind that flower. So I can go ahead and set up, get in there, frame up my subject, get up in maybe an F11, maybe F16, get that in focus and maintain that blurred background. This is a little bladder campion flower. It's in this tall grass. Of course, you wouldn't want to shoot that because you're going to have all that clutter behind it. But where this tall grass is growing, some of those little bladder campions grew through the grass and right way up here Look how high they sit up here above all that grass. Here's another one over here, isolated one. And that background behind there is way off in a distance. It's probably 30 feet at least away. So now I can get in here, set up my tripod, frame up this little group right here and photograph it at a higher f-stop, maybe f11 to f16, and get it all in focus and still maintain that blurred background. You can many times run into flowers where you have backgrounds way off in a distance. So on this cluster of flowers right here, I actually use this light color in the water back here as my background. So I got my camera angled so I could see that white color come in, and notice how it washed it out in the background. And I can shoot that at an f22 if I wanted to and get it all in focus and maintain that blur because that background is so far away. Same with this flower here. You can see background so far off that, again, you can get into those higher f-stops and get the depth of field you need to get your flower in focus and still maintain that blur. Or like here, that tree line back there's 100 yards away. So you do run into those situations out in the fields and parks and stuff where you can find flowers isolated with backgrounds way off in a distance. So let's go back to the spruce cone 4 feet in front of the spruce tree. Now you remember at 3.5, I was able to blur out that background at 4 feet behind the cone, but the problem was at 3.5, we couldn't get enough depth of field on our subject. Now, let's say that we wanted to shoot at f8, but that 4 feet behind there is going to start bringing in clutter. But let's say we could move the camera maybe at a different angle, and instead of the tree being 4 feet behind it, there was another spruce tree that was 10 feet behind it. Now at 10 feet, if I'm shooting at f8, won't have enough depth of field to reach back to 10 feet. So it'll just be a little more depth of field on my subject, but still a solid blur. Now let's say I wanted to go to f16 so I can get the whole thing in focus like I did on this shot here, where everything's in focus at f16. Now I would probably need the background, another camera angle, or maybe another cone with a background 20 feet away. And if I can find that, I can get that background 20 feet away, I can shoot at f16, get it all in focus and maintain that background. So that's how it's done. It's not that difficult. So you can see it's pretty simple concept. Now, let's say that you come into this situation here. You've got oxeye daisies, and you can see they're all in this tall grass. There's a lot of these daisies growing in here, and you want to shoot one of these oxeye daisies. But as you can see, there's not one flower in this little area here that isn't just consumed with clutter all around it. So sometimes you're going to run into those situations where you're not going to be able to find the flower you want with the background far enough, so you can get a nice clean background with everything in focus on the subject. So you have to learn when to walk away. You have to just say, well, this isn't going to work here. I'd rather not produce a poor quality image. I just won't shoot here. I'll go find something else to shoot. Now, let's say you really needed to get a shot of that oxeye daisies. You're doing an article for a magazine and they want oxeye daisies, and you need to get a shot of that flower with a nice, clean, blurred background, right? You still can do that. There's still a way to do that. You remember those backgrounds I taught you how to make for shooting indoors? Well, guess what? Now you take them with you when you go outdoors, and you shoot it outdoors behind your subject. I will tell you, even though I taught you that other method that I used for many years, but since I've been using backgrounds, I don't bother with that anymore. I just find my subject and I pop a background behind it and I shoot it with my backgrounds. And you can't tell the difference between my fake backgrounds and me shooting out naturally with grass in the background that's blurred out. So I no longer shoot that other method that I just taught you, but I like to teach that just to show people how it was done prior to people shooting with backgrounds. But all my flower shots now are out in the field are done with backgrounds behind them. And it makes it so much easier and faster than trying to find that isolated flower with the background 10, 15, 20 feet away. So here I'm shooting some lily of the valleys. You know, in about another 6-7 weeks, we're going to have these little lily of the valleys popping in the woods up here. And they are very difficult to shoot because they're low to the ground. For one, you got to be on your hands and knees. And the other problem is, see how tightly packed they are together, and they're so cluttered. It's very difficult to shoot them. Now, you notice what I'm holding my background with? There's the plamp again. Remember the plamp we were using to hold our diffusers? Now the plamp's holding my backgrounds for me. So when I shot this, I found a really nice little group of these flowers with some nice leaves, and I liked the composition, but this area up in here, there was clutter back there. So all I needed that background to do is just clean up that little area right there. Otherwise, I would have a bunch of random leaves and clutter in the background. So I, a lot of times will just hold them, because many times the flowers I shoot are kind of tall. And so I'll just actually hold it behind my subject with my hand. Sometimes I'll be able to use them with the plant. Now what I'm doing now with my 26 meg Fuji camera is I can just put a background behind my flower, shoot a larger area, and then crop out what I need in post-processing. So I don't have to get real tight in with my zoom lens. Same with this little loop in here. I just put my background behind it and shot a larger area and then cropped out what I want in post-processing. So that's what I was saying about bringing my macro lens. I don't really frame up things anymore like I used to try to avoid doing any cropping, because with these larger megapixel cameras, I can crop smaller areas out, so I don't have to worry about getting in so tight on my shots. Now, for shooting outdoors, I use my backpack to carry my backgrounds. Now, most backpacks, newer backpacks, have an area that is designed so you can slide in a laptop or slide in a notebook, or whatever you want to. You have a larger thing you want to slide down into that little area. I use that for my backgrounds. Now, my backpack is kind of small because I don't carry a lot of equipment. So I can only handle up to an 8.5 by 11 to fit into my backpack. And that has actually worked very well for me. Most of the time I'm just shooting smaller flowers, and so it's always worked. 8.5, 11 size has worked just fine for me. But if you have a larger backpack where you can slide in larger prints, then you could always make them a little larger if you wanted to. So give yourself options when you're shooting out in the field. You want to shoot multiple f-stops. If you're not sure where you should be with your f-stop, shoot multiple f-stops. You don't want to come home from a shoot and find out that you only shot one image and you don't like the depth of field you got. Maybe you didn't get enough depth of field, something's a little fuzzy. Maybe you got more depth of field than you wanted. Maybe you wanted half in focus, half out of focus. But if you only had one f-stop that you shot with, then you may not be happy when you see it when you get home. And if you don't like what you see, you may not be able to go back and reshoot that subject. And it may not even be there when you go back to reshoot it. So while you're there, while you've got your tripod set up, shoot at least 3, better even is 5 different f-stops. And then when you get home, you can always decide which one's the best and scrap the other ones. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. I just set up 2 calla lilies in my house and used a black background. And I just focused somewhere up in here on this little tip right here. And I shot with the 90mm macro lens at 2.8, smallest f-stop on that lens. And you can see it's blurry on the front flower, and you can see it softens the flower that's directly behind that one. So on the second shot, I went up from 2.8 up to f8. Now, when I say shoot 5 different f-stops, I don't mean f-stops that are right next to each other, because you wouldn't see much difference. So you got to skip a few every time you change f-stops. So I went from 2.8, then I jumped up to f8, and this is the shot with it f8. And so now you can see a little more depth of field starting to come into both front and back flower. Then I went up to f11. So skipped a few, went to f11, a little more depth of field coming in. Then I went up to f16. A little more depth of field, and then I went to f22. So f22 got most of it in focus, a little bit soft right in here, but most all of it's in focus at 22. So now I can go back and look at these 5 images and decide which one I like the best. Now, do I like this with everything in focus? Do I want the f16 with a little softness in the flower in the background, or do I want the f11 with a little more softness? Or how about the f8, a little more softness, or maximum softness at the 2.8? So you can see I've got a wide range of f-stops that gives me different looks. So then I can decide which one I like the best. All right, so that's all I'm going to teach you tonight, but you can learn a ton more from my macro photo club that I started about 5 years ago. And the whole idea of the macro club is to teach people how to do macro photography through videos. And so I have over 260 instructional videos, and that covers 4 different categories. So there's a little over 100 videos of me out in the field, actually photographing subjects in the field and in the woods. And then I have videos on post-processing. I've got videos on composition, and I've got videos on equipment. So 260 instructional videos. Now, when I started this club, I was hoping to get about 150, 200 members. And here 5 years later, we are over 2,700 members from 28 countries. It's amazing. The internet opens us up to the whole world. We also have a Facebook group that's just for our members, where we got about 1,400 of our members that join that group, and they post their images and share images and ask questions and all that. And it's a lifetime membership. You only pay one time. You never have to pay again. It's $99. It's not like other video programs. You got to pay a monthly fee or a yearly fee. This is a one-shot deal and you're done. You'll always have access to the videos. If you're interested in joining, you can go to my website. You see at the bottom, tinylandscapes.com. And at the top of the website, you'll see some links there, different links, and just look for the one in the center that says Macro Photo Club. Click on that. It'll give you some more information about the club and how you can sign up for it. So, but yeah, if you're interested in learning more about macro, there's a ton more you can learn about through these videos. So a lot of it is on subject matter when I'm in the field, just showing you all the different subjects throughout the 4 seasons that I shoot. Okay, so Hylos, you want to come back in? I'm going to stop my share here.
Thank you, Mike. That's I've learned a lot. I don't know about the rest of them, but
well, that's
it was
good.
fantastic.
Great. Basically, what you learned is all you need to know. It's pretty simple.
Well, that's what I was thinking. It goes all the way from which camera to buy all the way to print something.
Yeah.
And how to do each one of those things.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we got anybody got any questions or anything in here? Or did he explain it so good we don't need any questions?
Yeah. Yeah, they can either type it into the chat box, or if they don't want to talk, or if they want to open up their mics and ask questions, I'll be more than happy to hang out and answer whatever I can for them.
Mike, I do have one question.
Yeah, Rick.
On cleaning up the noise that you get from diffraction at f32 or other really high apertures, which software did you say you felt worked best for that?
Well, they all work good. The new Topaz has that sharpening program AI, and I've heard people swear by that. They say it's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I do have it.
Yeah,
I haven't tried it for that purpose yet.
I use Smart Photo Editor, which has a built-in sharpening program built into the software, and so I that's what I use for my sharpening. But I've got some pretty blurry images that came out of a camera that look tack sharp when I'm done. They work. I'm telling you, it works. And it just saves you the hassle of doing that focus stacking. To me, it's just a waste of time when I can shoot it with one f-stop and get it all in focus. And if I'm using a background behind my subject, I can still shoot at f32, because when it reaches beyond the flower, all it's going to do is hit that solid color background. So I don't have to worry about, looking for a flower with a background 20 feet away. I just pop a background behind it. It's so simple. Macro photography is very easy to do.
Great job tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rick.
Anybody else? Pat?
Mike, I really want to thank you for spending time with us this evening.
Oh, it's
Hylos, I'd like to thank you for getting Mike. I mean, Mike, I really had a good time. I picked up some nice tips I can use.
Good.
So